Rents. We'll be in Sarasota, technically Venice, next week for an event that I am super excited about with Suncoast Searchlight, a nonprofit newsroom covering Sarasota, Manatee, and I believe DeSoto counties. We are doing essentially a community conversation about data centers, data center development, looking at the politics and the policy of data centers, some of the things that the industry has been lobbying for and against in Tallahassee, some of the ways data center industry money is pouring into Florida elections this year, the way in which this issue is manifesting as clearly one of the front burner issues for Florida voters in so many races. We are going to be joined too by Emily Mahoney of the Tampa Bay Times, who has basically become the state's leading data center reporter. She has just absolutely owned this beat over the last 6 months to a year or so. So really excited for that event. That will be Tuesday, August 11th at the Jacaranda Library in Venice. It starts.
And we are so glad that this event came together. Jason Garcia with Seeking Rents reached out and asked if we would be interested in co-hosting a forum, and we jumped at the opportunity. As I was just telling him, we are huge fans of his work. And so we are delighted to be able to participate with him in this session tonight. And so thankful for all of you for coming out on a Tuesday evening when you can get home with your families to spend it with us, talking about an incredibly important topic. Before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of background on Suncoast Searchlight in case you've not heard of us before. We are a 501c3 nonprofit newsroom. We launched last year in February and have been producing watchdog, accountability, and investigative reporting since then, focused primarily on Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties, but also doing some statewide work as well. We do original journalism, so work that we produce in-house. We do a lot of collaborative journalism. Michael Barfield's here from Florida Trident. We do a lot of work with him. Also Bradenton Herald, WUSF, WGCU, and others. And supportive journalism. So we'll help out other news organizations if they have needs. We do that quite a bit. And then community engagement events like this. We are a very small newsroom. Not as small as Jason, who's a one-man show, but small nonetheless. Most of us are actually here in this room tonight, and a couple of us are on the panel. We have many media partners across the region. These are organizations, newsrooms who routinely pick up our work. We make all of our work available for free. Anybody can read it for free, and anybody can republish it for free. So even if you've never heard of Suncoast Searchlight before, you very likely have read our work via one of these other media outlets. Part of our mission is to strengthen the entire local media ecosystem, which sounds like jargon, but it's not. We really want to make sure that people have access to really good reporting at a time when local newsrooms have been shrinking. And shrinking they have been. There have been newspaper closures and staffing reductions across the country. 2.5 newspapers close in the United States every single week on average. More than half of the nation's counties have little to no local news source, and even in places that do have newspaper organizations, the staff are a fraction of the size as they used to be. So journalism is very important, and not a lot of people are doing it, and so we are glad to be filling that need. When there is not robust journalism, a whole bunch of bad things happen. I can't promise that just because we're here, we're stopping all of this, but I feel like we are doing our part to make sure at the very least there's accurate, well-researched information. And if we get something wrong, we have a corrections policy, we correct it, we are accountable, we are accessible, we are real people, and we are not bots. Nonprofit newsrooms like ours are proliferating across the United States. We're not by any means the only one, but we are the one that is serving your community. And we do a lot of these community engagement events, and so I hope you will continue to come to events like these. We put them in our newsletter. Speaking of which, you might have been asked at the entrance if you would like to be added to our newsletter subscriber list. If you are not already, I hope you said yes. Please subscribe. That is the most important way that you can stay connected to us and we can stay connected to you. Tonight, data centers in Florida. Our lovely panelists include Jason Garcia of Seeking Rents. Please subscribe to him as well. Emily Mahoney at the Tampa Bay Times, who's been doing some of the best work on data centers, covering them statewide. She just had a great story today about the data center in DeSoto County. I saw that, it was growing. Christian Casale with Suncoast Searchlight. He covers local government and has done some reporting as well for us on data centers, specifically some of the moratoriums that have passed. And Herman, who's done a lot of work on the data center proposal in DeSoto County. Also want to take a quick mention here, if there are any elected officials or candidates for public office in the audience, would you please raise your hand? Thank you so much for coming. Please help me. And I think that's my last slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Again, thank you for coming.
I'm going to hand it over to Emily to kick this off. We can just pass the mic.
Okay.
And for those standing in the back, there are a handful of seats up here in the front and the front few rows, so just in case you want to sit down and get more comfy, there are a few more seats. Well, thank you so much to everybody who's here. This room is incredible. It's so nice to see so many people turn out for this event. And I think it really speaks to the topic at hand, which is data centers. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about is how the impact of sort of regular people on this issue has been really extraordinary to witness, and it's been a huge part of my coverage. But I'll just start off by giving you a little bit more information about me. My name's Emily Mahoney. I cover energy at the Tampa Bay Times. I've been a Florida journalist for 8 years. And I've been covering energy for almost 3 years now. Before that, I spent much of my career covering politics, including in Tallahassee as a state house correspondent. I also covered DeSantis' presidential campaign. So my job now is really fun because it intersects with politics, but I get to be an expert on energy, which right now means a lot of reporting about data centers. It also means covering the utility companies that charge you for your electricity bill. It means covering EVs and things along those lines as well. So just as a super basic primer, if you're here tonight, you probably know what a data center is, but just so to make sure we're all on the same page, as you all probably know, data centers are warehouses filled with computers, basically, that have actually been around for a long time. A lot of people think they're a new phenomenon, but we actually have many data centers already in Florida that have been here for a long time that didn't really cause anybody much heartburn because they were much smaller and they were used for fairly routine technology practices by businesses. But the new thing on the scene now that is making people concerned, and is what we're here to talk about tonight, are the large-scale data centers, sometimes called hyperscale data centers. And those are very different than what have existed previously. They can stretch for thousands of acres. They can use as much water as a small town, as much electricity as a small town, and are very resource hungry. And sort of over and over, as I've watched the data center, I like to joke that covering data center proposals in Florida is like playing a really elaborate game of whack-a-mole, because as soon as one disappears, there's 3 more that have popped up that I hadn't heard about before. And there's a reason for that. Data center proposals often begin sort of in the dark, and that's because local governments are allowed to sign non-disclosure agreements with data center companies. And so there are plenty of examples, especially in other parts of the country where the data center industry is farther along, where residents didn't even learn about the data center until it was too late to stop it. There was an opportunity this year in Tallahassee where lawmakers had a bill on data centers that would have outlawed NDAs between government officials and data center companies, but that protection was stripped out of the bill before final passage. So NDAs are still allowed in Florida, unfortunately, which means less transparency for the public, and it means keeping track of them is that much harder for us as journalists and for you as the public. But the concerns that we do see when they pop up are pretty consistent. People are concerned about water, of course, especially right now in the drought that we're in. People are concerned about electricity. Will their electric bills go up as a result? People are also concerned about air pollution. I think that's a part of this that gets a little bit less attention, but data centers often have diesel generators to support them, and diesel generators emit a ton of air pollution that can be very problematic to people's health. Noise pollution is also a huge concern, and another one that I find really particularly interesting and consistent is like cultural concerns. Data centers are often popping up in sleepier, more rural parts of the state where people live on purpose. They don't want to live by big industry, they don't want to live in a big city with tons of traffic, and they worry about how this giant facility could change the character of where they live. So those are some of the consistent themes I've seen popping up. And as I alluded to earlier, the political backlash from everyday people on this issue has been extraordinary to watch. I've talked to folks in Citrus County, in Fort Meade, which is in Polk County, which some of you may know. It looks like it could be the site of the first hyperscale data center in Florida, depending on how some final regulatory kinks get worked out. But people there who've never been involved before politically ever, one guy described himself as a shut-in, is now leading the sort of grassroots effort to oppose the Fort Meade data center. There's people from all political stripes, all agree that this issue is top of mind, it's making them get involved, and in some places it's causing the local governments to backpedal and to not approve the data centers. And I think Florida has a little bit of an advantage on this because we are sort of part of this second wave of states where the data center industry is coming to town. We've seen what happened in other states, and there's research now and lived experiences from people in places like Virginia where they're highly concentrated, that people in Florida we're not the first guinea pigs anymore, and when the rumblings start to happen in their communities, people are really getting organized. And it's been really incredible to watch. I was in Citrus County earlier this summer, where just like a bunch of retirees started a grassroots organization to fight against the data center proposal there. They held an event at a local building. It's called the Old Schoolhouse. It's basically a place where AA meetings are held, and there were more than 200 people who just showed up on the Saturday of a holiday weekend to learn about data centers, to sign petitions, to get involved. They were from all across the political spectrum. One of my favorite anecdotes is I have been in touch with one of the organizers against a different sort of strange data center proposal in the Okeechobee area. And the organizer of that sort of resistance movement is a 29-year-old progressive Tampa resident who's a gay man who has this incredible quote in my story, who's like, I'm a progressive 29-year-old gay man and I just helped defeat a data center proposal in a county that Trump won by 61 points. But it's like we all agree on this issue, and I think that's been one of the things that I think really ties this all together, is that like no matter where people fall on the political spectrum, this industry and the way that it's coming in to where we live has felt exploitive to them, because these are really wealthy companies, they're very powerful companies. They have basically unlimited resources, and they're going up against the little guy, but when the little guy bands together, you know, as they did in Citrus County, for example, that proposal is currently sort of on the back burner because local officials saw the local reaction. And so quickly I want to just go through some of the other things as like a table setter for what I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about, and that's the statewide landscape. So DeSantis pushed and signed a consumer protection law, as you've probably read about, and it's a really interesting moment because I do think that that law, it was a response to this sort of political tide that we're seeing of people, again, all across the political spectrum, expressing deep opposition to this, and it was a significant piece of consumer protection law, but I think it's important to note how it's actually enforced. As I noted before, it could have outlawed NDAs, it did not, so that's still allowed in Florida. But also in terms of ensuring that Floridians don't pay more on their electric bills because of data centers, the actual enforcement mechanism of that falls to the utility regulators of our state, which is the Public Service Commission, which you've probably never heard of, but it's an obscure commission that regulates the utilities in the state, like FPL, like TECO, like Duke, and has a well-documented history of letting the utilities often get what they want. And so in a couple of weeks, actually, Duke Energy is taking its plan to the PSC for how it wants to structure the way that it charges data centers money and the way that those costs are or are not passed on to Duke customers. And it's taking that plan to those PSC commissioners in a couple of weeks. And so we're gonna see for the first time how seriously are these utility commissioners going to take their responsibility under the law? How strictly are they going to read these sort of vague provisions in the law? And that's going to be a really interesting test case for how this affects everybody in Florida moving forward. And I could talk about this for a really long time, but I'm going to keep it moving along. I think I can pause for questions for me, but we're also going to, you can ask questions at any point in the panel, so I'll throw it back to Alice.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Go ahead, Jono.
So am I understanding correctly that the power companies are guaranteed to make a profit and that the expense for bringing new facilities online is borne by the ratepayers?
Should I take the microphone back?
Repeat the question.
Okay, yeah, so the question was about kind of the specifics, the nitty-gritty of the structure of data center costs and how they're borne. So yes, the investor-owned utilities in Florida, which is a fancy way of saying like the corporate utilities in Florida, FPL, Duke, and TECO primarily, their shareholders are guaranteed a specific rate of return. So yes, the utility companies have a guaranteed profit that's decided by those utility commissioners. And under the law, any new power plants, for example, that need to be built to power the data centers the cost for those are supposed to only fall upon the data centers. But there's a lot of room for interpretation among the utility commissioners for how that's going to actually happen, which is why the Duke case in a few weeks is so important.
I'm gonna take 2 more questions.
Would they have to build, would then they be responsible for building their own grid, or no?
The data center
You have
companies.
2 microphones.
That's definitely something that is being talked about now. A lot more I think the data center industry has seen the pushback and is becoming more willing, sort of upfront, to say we are willing to build our own power plants, our own microgrids, and so that I think could be something that we'll see in the future. That does not alleviate all of the concerns that residents have, especially when it comes to air pollution and water use and things like that. But yes, that could be one way to alleviate the strain on the grid. Do you want to move on?
There was one, I
Okay.
think I saw your hand first. Back
In
here.
regard to the Tallahassee legislation and the energy companies agreements, who's profiting from that? Who's making the money on that? Why did the legislation get muddled instead? Why isn't it just straightforward how it should be? Someone is benefiting.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a ton of the utility companies in Florida are very powerful. They're one of the biggest political donors in the state. They always are. They want data centers to come to Florida because the huge demand for electricity that they have will make them more money and more money for their shareholders. And like we said, they get a guaranteed percentage of profit. So if the denominator goes up, that share of profit becomes a larger number. And so, I mean, not to mention the fact that the data center industry itself is also fueled by companies like Amazon and Meta that have basically unlimited resources. So there's a lot of moneyed interests who want to see data centers come to Florida, which is why we're still having this conversation despite the fact that a lot of people don't want them here.
Follow up on that, is there a lobbyist organization for the energy companies who's helping write legislation?
I think Jason's gonna talk a lot about that in his, so
Yeah.
hold that thought.
Yes.
I was just gonna add to that too. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the DeSoto County data center that some of us have been covering. But one of the companies that lobbied in support of the version of the bill that did pass was DCIP Group, the CEO of DCIP Group, which is the developer that has proposed a hyperscale data center in DeSoto County. And the reason that company supported the version of the bill that passed, got behind it, was because while it regulates on the grid data centers, meaning data centers that are pulling from the local power grid, it doesn't clearly regulate data centers that are generating power, for example, by tapping into a natural gas pipeline and building their own power plants, or powering their facilities with gas power, with gas turbines. So that I think is one of the interest groups that got behind this legislation. I wanted to talk a little bit about public records access and transparency surrounding data centers, because I got interested in this topic a few months ago. I learned after an initial rezoning proposal went through in DeSoto County about this pending data center project there. And I was curious to learn more about the scope of it, and it seemed like at the time there wasn't a lot of community backlash, which was sort of unusual given that in a lot of the other places where data centers have been proposed, there has been a really strong community response. And so I reached out to the commissioners, and I had some interesting conversations with local officials. And I also looked into what the applications for rezoning actually said, and what communications had transpired between local officials and the developers. And so I want to actually give DeSoto County a lot of credit here, because I submitted a few records requests and they returned them very quickly, and they sent me hundreds of records of communications, emails, even AI generated summaries of Zoom meetings that officials had held with developers or with representatives of DCIP Group. And from that, we learned that this was actually a much bigger proposal than we initially thought. So the company had first rezoned 34 acres of land on a decommissioned power plant, and they had proposed one facility there that looked like it was going to be relatively small, at least as far as larger data center projects go. But what they were planning in the longer run was a kind of sprawling set of facilities over 1,300 acres. And it was going to be, if it worked out for the developer, it would have ended up being closer to a dozen facilities. And so we learned all of this through really robust public records that were provided by the county. And under this new bill, because it allows local agencies to sign NDAs, and for those NDAs to exempt the records within them, we might not have gotten all of those records if they had signed an NDA. So I just want to kind of emphasize, our reporting is made possible by that type of records access, and without it, it's much more challenging for us, and therefore the communities that we're reporting on to learn about these projects. And I think in part because of our reporting, but also just because news travels fast in small towns, there ended up being a really, really, really intense community backlash in DeSoto to this project. And the county passed a moratorium on data centers. It doesn't apply to the pending applications, but I think that there's a strong possibility that the commissioners will actually say no to these these developments. So, yeah, that's the kind of my public records rant. I don't know if anybody has more questions that we didn't get to before.
Yes. First, thank you guys for being here. This is a very important topic. My name's Joe Nunder. Christian, I know you for the record. I am one of your Sarasota County Commissioners. And I don't know if you have had the opportunity to look at our meeting prior to our break. We're currently on break, but our board did take a stand on data centers to kind of address the vernacular of what the difference between a high-scale data center and some of the other wording. So just to be clear, if you're not familiar with what our board has done for the next 12 months, no, not now, never, at least for 12 months, until we can clean this up and our community has the transparency that you ladies were talking about, and make sure that our community here in Sarasota County is protected, it's transparent, and that from one commissioner standpoint, we don't want this here at all. So just for the record, didn't know if you knew that, wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start with the most basic question: is why? Why do we need these things? What are they for? How do they help out our society? We're talking about them being built, but we don't even have any idea why. And don't tell me it's for AI. First off, we don't even need AI, but how do they help us? How do they give us food? How do they give us clean water, air? What are they for?
I mean, the hyperscalers are largely powering AI. So if you like to chat with Grok, or if you like to chat with ChatGPT, and that's an oversimplification, but the hyperscalers are powering the AI sort of revolution. I think that's it. I think that's the answer, and I'm going to hand it over to Emily because she probably has a more fulsome picture. But yeah.
No, I mean, you're right, but also sort of even if you don't use ChatGPT, you're still probably using AI, whether you're trying to or not. If you're searching on Google, it's integrated in that. If the last time I opened an Adobe PDF, it said, "Do you want me to summarize this document for you?" And I said, "It's a one-page document. I don't need to do that. Thanks very much." But it is being integrated into almost everything, kind of without people saying whether they want that or not. I will say that data center advocates in the industry also point out that they are being used for technology in the banking industry. Like huge amounts of data storage are also what they're used for, so that has to do with like the banking and healthcare industries. Don't ask me to elaborate on that further because I am not an expert in that, but I do think the proliferation of what we're seeing now is largely due to the fact that AI is being integrated so much into everything. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I did not expect my first comments to be defending the data center industry, so it's not a position I'm comfortable with. But like the one argument that I've heard the industry make that does make some sense to me is there are like national security implications. Controlling data centers is controlling AI ultimately, right? And so if you don't do it in the U.S., it does seem logical to me that it will happen in other countries, right? Like China, Russia, other nations will develop this technology if the U.S. doesn't. Now that's an argument for building data centers somewhere in the U.S. It is not an argument for building data centers in any particular state. But I do think, it is impossible to sort of put a genie back in the bottle when it comes to like technological innovation. So there probably does have to be data centers at some point. And the question is trying to find a way that does it in that it does not hurt other people, that the benefits from them are shared, that the resource extraction is not so destructive as to make the benefits unworth it. But yeah, I think I wouldn't sort of operate from the assumption that we cannot have data centers at all. Like generally might not need them, might want them here. It seems like a good place for the desert, maybe, but we'll see.
I think one other element of this is that because I think there's a speculative element to this as well. There have been more proposed data centers, or there's more, the amount of energy required to back up all of the data centers, or to, power the data centers that have been proposed across the country is more energy than like we can power. And so there's an element of this that is speculative, I think, and that does come from just the hype around AI and like the massive investment investment in these companies.
Just to follow up on the great comments in the front row and thank you. To follow up. Oh, is it not? I can speak louder. The genie is out of the bottle. In some cases, I think it is out of the bottle without us realizing that this is happening. We used to be able to search on Google without getting an AI summary. You can't do that anymore. You can find another search engine that does not do that. And by doing that, you personally are reducing the demand for data, because it's all about how much data is needed. Some companies have an AI policy, which basically says how you can and cannot use AI. There are different types of AI that demand more data than others. ChatGPT, streaming something really intensive, creating AI, actually creating your content for you. Being mindful of what we each and every one of us are doing is part of the solution, at least in my mind.
Thank you. I'm gonna take one more question and then I'll pass the mic down.
Thank you. My question is from a concerned perspective, but I'm wondering if one of the talking points of the AI industry are jobs, and if so, is it the type of thing that will create jobs? And do that, promote that? Is that one of their promotions?
They don't create very many jobs. That's the short version. Yeah, that is a talking point of the industry. That speaking more specifically to data centers and not AI in general, which obviously includes tons of stuff in Silicon Valley, and there might be more jobs there. But specifically to data centers, jobs are often a promise that is made, but they create much more temporary construction jobs typically than they do long-term jobs. And in other places where the industry is farther along, we've seen that those promises have been overblown.
Yeah, the data center proposal in DeSoto County, I think, cited like 25 jobs or less. But thereabouts, and we're talking about a bunch of facilities. It just doesn't take much to keep them running once they're up. It's computers sitting in a warehouse, basically. I'm gonna pass it on to Jason.
Well, I guess we're sort of bouncing around a lot here. I think I'll start is by talking about like the importance of people actually paying attention to this. So like when you think through, sort of to the point you were making about like making educated choices, but like also to like controlling the policy. Ultimately, the more engaged folks are with this, the more responsive the policymakers will be to this. And part of, I'll tell you a story of like, you know, Tallahassee, the Florida legislature, the governor's office, they operate sort of like completely untethered from the public interest for the most part, unless they know people are paying attention. And to give you an example about this, they've been working on sort of data center policy for a decade now, right? Like, I think it was 2017 that the Florida legislature passed a tax rate for data centers, right? Like, we actually subsidize, if they get built, we subsidize data centers in Florida right now. And that came from Florida Power and Light and Florida Crystals, who were in the early stages of developing what became Project Tango in Palm Beach County. That tax break is on the books specifically to help that project. Emily's done some great reporting around this, that others have tapped into it since then. And all of this was done long before most people even knew what data centers really were, right? And so the importance of engaging and for them knowing that you are paying attention really does sort of start to change the policy, despite all of the money that gets thrown into this. And so, but it's important to sort of stay engaged every step of the way. And I think Senate Bill 484, which is we've alluded to a few times, is the legislation they passed this year that regulates that is pitched as like protecting consumers from data centers, right? So I think Ron DeSantis, when he signed the bill, it actually stood at a podium that said like protecting Florida consumers or something like that. But the thing is, that legislation, as we've alluded to, is far weaker than what they initially pitched. So Emily mentioned, a couple of folks have mentioned, the bill initially would have banned non-disclosure agreements, right?
That came out of the bill, and that was something that was incredibly important to the utilities, to the data center interests lobbying against this bill, because again, sort of public participation is so key to controlling this stuff. They want to limit that kind of stuff. But we need people paying attention to the entire legislative process so that sort of stuff doesn't come out. Another example, an early version of the bill would have banned data centers on agricultural land. It would have banned data centers within 5 miles of a home or school. All of that came out of the bill, right? And again, because they as long as they keep talking around the idea of like, look, we're dealing with data centers and sort of trusting that folks aren't paying attention to the real details. So this kind of engagement is critically important. I do want to say, in addition, on top of all that, that is not to say that Senate Bill 484 is not a valuable piece of policy in certain respects. And specifically, I imagine a lot of folks in here are familiar with Senate Bill 180. Is that folks know this? For folks that don't know, this is a bill that the legislature passed in 2025 that was ostensibly supposed to be about hurricane recovery. They said what we're doing here is we're making it so that local governments can't stop home and business owners from rebuilding after their home or property gets damaged in a storm. Except the way they wrote the bill is they essentially preempted all land development regulation statewide for like through 2027. It was essentially like a statewide moratorium on growth management, essentially. And it has been just an absolute disaster of a law, right? But it's one that is very important to a handful of really prominent developers, including particularly in the Sarasota area. But Senate Bill 44, one of the things it did was it explicitly empowers local governments to control zoning decisions around data centers. And why that is important is because of Senate Bill 180, right? Sarasota County, without Senate Bill 44, could not have done anything about it, could not do a moratorium on data centers, because Senate Bill 180 would easily be used to knock that down, right? So there is some good stuff in this bill, but again, it could have been so much better, and that's why, as I bring back to this idea of people staying engaged and paying attention is so important. That can actually sort of overcome the influence of money. When elected officials realize like voters are actually paying attention to an issue, they govern far differently than they do on every other issue, essentially. Do we want to pass it around or take questions?
A big thing you hear a lot of the proponents of it say they talk about this closed loop cooling and that it doesn't use any water. I know you've studied that and seen that that's not exactly true either. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so the question is about sort of the reliability of the claims that data centers are using closed loop water and not draining a lot of water. I'm going to tell you, I don't actually know a lot about that. Is there anybody here that's sort of comfortable addressing closed loop cycles? I will say, I think the electricity consumption is a bigger concern than the water consumption because of that. But, I hear it well.
I know a bit about that.
Yeah, so closed loop, for those unfamiliar, is the claim that like they don't need to suck in as much new water. They can keep reusing the same water over and over again, which is kind of intuitive from the name. But water still does evaporate, so my understanding broadly is that it uses less water than the alternative, but it still uses a lot of water.
And a lot more electricity.
And
Yes, and it takes extra electricity to
And
cool
then
the
I
water
also
down.
read that they have to use different coolants actually to keep the water cool. And they use like antifreeze, they use heavy metals, PFAs and everything to keep that water going, inside the system. And then when they bleed the lines, that gets pushed out into the, out of the system. And
So the
into
thing
our
about
environment.
the thing about data centers in general is like the technology is changing really fast. First, there was no closed loop. Now there is closed loop. Now there's also talk of, I think it's called dry cooling, where they don't use any water at all, but they use a ton of electricity to use fans instead of water. So the industry is moving very fast to try to address how resource intensive these facilities are. And it makes it challenging to report on, and I think to Jason's point, makes it all the more important to keep paying attention. But I think has also like prompted a lot of officials to say like, hang on, let's pause this for a year or two and see what these things look like. Maybe they'll be much smaller in the near future. Maybe they won't be as resource intensive. And I think like everything is just moving really fast.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Phil Stokes, and I'm a Northport commissioner. We have an application that's been submitted for data center in the city of Northport. And to cycle back to your comments regarding Bill 484 and 180, therein lies the rub for us. 484 is a weak bill. 180 is a very, very strong bill. The city of Northport has no code regarding data centers. So on the 31st of this month, we're gonna attempt to vote for a retroactive moratorium, which is gonna be a heavy legal lift, okay? But secondarily, I'm also pushing, and hopefully my fellow commissioners are gonna support it, to enact regulation. And that regulation can get written, but Bill 180 preempts us from being able to actually enact it and enforce it until August of 2027. And if there's another storm, it can get pushed out another year. So I will tell you, in our city, this is an issue where we've drawn a line. And if push comes to shove, this will be adjudicated in court, because it's gonna have to be. The governor said, great, let local governments deal with this, but most local governments just don't have regulation to address it. I mean, it falls under general industry, and they can build it. What is there we could do to enforce that the state-of-the-art technology is used? That's the problem. Technology exists to deal with water, power, air quality, and sound. But these big companies only care about their dollars, and the reality is gonna be, what do we do to force them to build to the state-of-the-art? And there's the rub. Northport may well become, that lightning rod for it. Encourage people, come to the 31st meeting at Northport Precinct at 6 o'clock, because you're gonna see some fireworks. We're gonna have a lot of people here talking about this.
Yeah, so the comment for those that didn't hear that was about the city of Northport potentially imposing a retroactive moratorium on data centers and developing stringent data center regulations, and whether or not that will survive a Senate Bill 180 challenge. And I think that is absolutely right, that this will be litigated at some point, because what you see if you read a lot of the county attorney opinions in places that are passing these moratoriums, one reason you're seeing moratoriums instead of outright bans, right, is because they're betting that courts will look more favorably on a moratorium as authorized as 484 trumping 180. But whether or not it will, ultimately that's going to be a decision of law by a judge, right?
Our moratorium too is going to carve out any of those properties that have been damaged, which was covered under Bill 180.
Right.
It's still a heavy legal lift.
Yeah, it is absolutely a heavy legal lift. It will be, and we have seen judges have taken a pretty broad interpretation of 180. Folks in Southwest Florida, Manatee County has had an impact fee ordinance struck down, even though impact fees aren't really a land development regulation, right? So they've already taken a broader reading of 180 in some courts. Now, I will say this does come back to the more people stay engaged, the more people pay attention, the more people make sure their elected officials know they're paying attention. The courts are ultimately, these are increasingly political animals themselves, right? So if you get a high-profile case testing a data center regulation under 180 and it gets appealed up to the Florida Supreme Court, obviously you never know how a court is going to rule, but if this is an issue that the governor of Florida is feeling people breathing down his neck on, he's going to be leaning behind the scenes on the Florida Supreme Court in that sort of situation. So even then, just the mobilization of people and letting elected officials know that you are watching and will hold them accountable can influence even court decisions. But just to bring back, I think you are absolutely right that this will be litigated somewhere in Florida, and that will have an enormous impact on whether or not any of this stuff stands.
Other than the court of law, there is the court of public opinion. You said it. The truth is, a lot of these data center companies, they want an easy pathway like anybody. And if they're facing citizenry that's up in arms, and there's typically more than just a data center, there's technology around it, there's other things that go on. Nobody wants to be where they're really not wanted. So it is so important that people speak up and speak out, because these things are not that healthy. And worse, there's nothing that controls how they're built.
Yeah, I'm going to use this as a little pivot time for, the most important time to let people, let elected officials know you're paying attention is during election season. So maybe
Christian, let's give you the mic.
Well, thank you everyone for sticking around. The other night I was watching the Rays just beat the heck out of the Mariners, and there was an advertisement for Byron Donalds, and he said, as Florida governor, he would make sure that data centers pay their own way as far as utility rates when they go into communities. To me, that was interesting for two reasons. One, despite his big fundraising lead, Donald sees that data centers are a political liability. But then also two, partly because of his lead, he can't say no to data centers. You know, I was kind of racking up the numbers earlier. At least $5 million coming from out of state from kind of AI moguls going to Donald's campaign. We've covered that. $900,000 directly from AI data center developers here in Florida. You know, if he is governor, you know, he would have a bully pulpit to kind of be a spokesperson for this kind of stuff. He would select the members of the Public Service Commission. You know, he would have a lot of influence over the legislature. And I think something we're seeing right now across the state and across the country are people really rebelling against data centers at city commission meetings, county commission meetings, planning board meetings. There's videos on social media of people screaming at them and doing everything short of throwing tomatoes at them. And the thing is, you saw it here in Sarasota County, they just passed a 12-month moratorium. You know, Commissioners Mark Smith and Joe Nunder were the biggest supporters of the moratorium. They're also both running for re-election. And Joe was sitting here a minute ago. If you couldn't tell, he's running for re-election. So, in Florida right now, there is a development backlash. I think we've all kind of felt that the last few years. We saw that in Sarasota County in the 2024 elections. And there is a recognition from powers that be that people can fill up these rooms and really kind of take it to their commissioners and really have impact. So what they're doing is they're making a lot of those decisions then come from Tallahassee. And there is a blueprint now we see with SB 180. Allison, our colleague Derek Gilman, covered a lot of these kind of preemption bills coming from Tallahassee. We see that with the way that the property tax amendment would gut local budgets. There is a concerted effort to move a lot of power to Tallahassee because there is recognition that it'd be a lot harder for all of you to drive up to Tallahassee every time there's a bill, every time there's a public hearing, and it's a lot harder to get a hold of Byron Donalds. So as long as this power is in county commissions, I think especially this election cycle, we'll see them against it. But again, for Sarasota County, that only lasts a year, and we'll see if they stick to that next July. Another point I want to make about Donalds is there was a quote I think this is kind of the point is maybe his lead is pretty comfortable at this point. He had said that Florida has an extra 5 gigawatts of electricity on its grid, so that leaves us room to build 5 1-gigawatt data centers. So I think there is a lot of complacency from politicians, especially in Florida right now, that you know they have such a comfortable lead. They have a supermajority in the legislature that there won't be a lot of opposition to them. That's kind of all I have. Any questions on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. I was just gonna say a gigawatt is really, really, really big.
It's like 750,000 homes or something like that?
Yeah, it's like a mid-sized city.
Is that proposed on federal lands?
Sorry?
Is that proposed on federal lands?
Which ones?
What he's talking about.
He was just kind of saying, in general, Florida could get 5 gigawatts of data centers and we'd be like, cool. Like it'd all work out. And I think even if those utility companies are paying their own way, also worth mentioning, utility companies in Florida have given millions upon millions to Donald's campaign. There is also still the question of the pollution it brings to a community, whether it's the noise pollution, the impact on the water, the emissions that come from diesel centers. I think also, philosophically, like you had mentioned, you get a thing to AI summarize your one-page PDF. AI searches have like really harmed Google's traffic right now in the way that they're kind of pushing on everybody. And now we have these gigantic noisy centers in our communities that kind of signify that like this digital age that we're in is here to stay. And I don't know if anyone can say like America is a happier place over the past 20 years with the proliferation of social media and AI. So I think, you know, that is a big reaction to it, is people maybe don't want to accept that this is here to stay, this kind of lifestyle that we have.
I'm gonna make a shameless plug. for local news, which I don't need to do because you all are here and I'm preaching to the choir. But as Jason said, public involvement on this topic is huge. We have evidence of how it's affected this issue. But regular people have jobs and they can't spend their whole lives trying to watch these things and follow them through local governments. But you know whose job it is to do that is ours. So when you Google something and you get an AI summary, instead of taking the AI summary at face value, first of all, it could very likely be wrong. Second of all, you should click on the news story that it's pulling that information from, because it is taking our work and making it free and making it so you don't even have to click on our website. And supporting local news, however you want to do that, obviously, like I said, I'm preaching to the choir, y'all are here, but tell your friends. Reading an AI summary on Google is hurting local news actively, and it's important to understand where the source of that information comes from, and many times the source of that information is a local reporter doing the work.
Yeah. What I don't get is there any particular thing that makes Florida attractive to these data centers? I mean, you would think there are a lot of easier states to do this in, that the land's cheaper, the resources are more available. I mean, is there something that makes Florida attractive to them?
I have a speculation.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think Florida's a pretty safe red state right now, and it has been a safe red state internally in the State House and the Governor's Mansion for 25 years or so. So I think there is a lot of political capital among the Republican Party right now who are receiving a lot of these dollars, both from AI data center developers and regular housing developers, that they have a lot of leeway right now. And it'd be interesting for me to see if Donald's or Republican legislators lose support because of this in November. However, I don't know. I've not seen the Democratic Party campaigning on this. I don't know if there's much of a Democratic Party left in Florida. So it's interesting to me that they have not kind of capitalized this against the Republicans.
The data center industry also didn't choose Florida as its first choice. Data Center Alley, the highest concentration of data centers in the world, is in Virginia. There's other states like Texas, like Arizona, where they've already, like I said, we're kind of in the second wave. And that's because, and I talked to the industry about this, it's because of hurricanes and the disruption that they cause to power. And data centers need guaranteed power 24/7. But as the technology has improved and, there are things like generators that they can use and they've started running out of land in other places, Florida became a more attractive option. The industry looks for inexpensive land, it looks for the availability of power, and those are things that Florida does have, and it's especially in kind of the rural interior.
So, just want to add one quick thing, which is that it's not a single party issue. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan attended a groundbreaking ceremony of a major data center there, and so I think actually looking at who your elected officials are taking money from, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, is incredibly important if this is an issue that you're concerned about.
Hi, Christine Johnson with Big Waters Land Trust. My colleagues in other states, specifically Virginia and Texas, are seeing conservation easements being broken by eminent domain of the power companies saying they need that land for running transmission lines or for power plant growth. Are we seeing any movement in Florida to break conservation easements for AI centers, data centers?
I haven't seen that. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has.
No. I will say, sorry, the question was, are we seeing any effort to, by utility companies to use eminent domain to essentially break conservation easements and use that land for data centers? And the short answer is no, I've not seen that, although it's interesting you mentioned that, in that there was some legislation this past session to make it easier to take land out of conservation easements. And I think that failed to pass. But that is really interesting in that context, which is not something I thought, so I'm kind of just thinking out loud as you asked that question. I will say, if you've seen it in other states, it is obviously something that people are thinking about in this, so it's something to pay attention. And I just want to sort of, all of this sort of, you probably can guess, sort of ties back to like a root issue of money in politics too, right? And so, to the question of what makes Florida attractive, I think the reality of it, one of the things that makes Florida attractive to extractive industry sometimes is the fact that it's a big, expensive state, so candidates functionally have to raise lots of money, and it allows unlimited donations. So you can, literally, Florida Power and Light has given $1 million to Byron Donalds, right? Like, one company, $1 million to one politician, right? And so, we're talking about this all in the context of data centers, but there are like a million other issues that are important, and when data centers, if and when this gets addressed or solved, or the battle is won or lost, or however it plays out, there'll be another issue like this, right? And the sort of the root issue to try and get in front of, get out front of corporate capture and this sort of thing is addressing money in politics. So I want to sort of get on a soapbox about that, just be thinking about the larger things as you reach out to elected officials and you demand changes and stuff, be thinking about structural changes as well.
Could you just follow up on that? We are in election season, and Christian mentioned the demise of our Democratic Party that perhaps has been exaggerated as a local Democratic candidate for Congress right now, but could you speak to our local legislative delegation, Jason, and the influence perhaps of some of those industries specific to AI data centers, and what you've seen and uncovered that they've been accepting? And then my second question, maybe for Alice, you're talking about this speculative moment. I'm wondering, the big beautiful bill allows for 100% depreciation of hyperscale data centers 1 year after their implementation. And I'm wondering, when we already have 600 plus data centers in the US, our closest competitor when we talk about national security risk is China with maybe 150. How much of that is driving this rapid demand and investment to make that happen?
Okay, so Alice, you're gonna have to remember your part of the question. I think what you asked is data center money to the local delegation. Sarasota, Manatee County. And so I'm not gonna pretend to know off the top of my head how much Bill Connerly took from the data center industry, but I will say I actually just spent quite a bit of time digging into data center money in Florida politics, and the numbers are enormous. It was more than $22 million have already been spent in the 2026 elections by data center interests. And as part of that, I did go through and look through individual legislators who had taken those. And one guy who was on that list was Jim Buchanan, who's a state representative who's running for Senate now. A part of that is because he chairs the House Commerce Committee, which is where utility legislation moves through the House Committee. So he was an influential guy, and if you break into that money, it's an awful lot of utility money to Jim Buchanan. So he's a name, I'm just mentioning that because he stuck out as he was far and away the highest among what you would consider rank and file legislators. The House speakers, the Senate presidents, they get more than anybody else. But Jim Buchanan is a guy who has taken an awful lot of money from the data center industry, particularly in the context of a guy who's not in leadership himself.
Yeah, go for it. I just wanted to add to that. The interesting dynamic of how money moves in politics is James Buchanan's running for election for state senate right now as a House rep. He has no serious competition, apologies to Martin Hyde. And so he doesn't really need all of that money. What he's able to do is take that PAC money and give it to other campaigns, to other PACs. I spoke to a professor at UCF who kind of called it legalized money laundering. And it's really hard to track where this money starts and where it stops, because it can go through a dozen PACs and a dozen candidates, and they can all give to each other. And legislators watch each other's PACs, and they want to see who's giving to who and make sure you're giving enough so you can get enough sway in Tallahassee.
I have no idea whether the big beautiful bill or anxieties about China are contributing more to the growth of the AI industry or data centers being developed in the US, but certainly the fact that AI regulation has largely been pushed to the states, I think is something that Floridians should be looking at. It is kind of interesting, it's I think because this technology is changing so rapidly, it's hard to say whether a data center that was approved last week is going to be really profitable a year from now, or even by the time it's fully developed. And that's something that has came up in DeSoto County when the hyperscale data center was proposed there. Is people had initially, commissioners I think felt really optimistic about the possibility that this would end up being an extremely profitable enterprise, and the company was saying that maybe this would be valued, that these facilities could be valued at billions of dollars, and that it would bring in, you know, more than $30 million a year, I think, in tax revenue was what they were hoping for. And in a county like DeSoto, that's, I think, a really attractive proposition. And so, but right, the question of whether they really would end up being valued like that by the time they're actually developed is, I couldn't answer that question.
Just to add to that really important point that Alice just made, because we've been talking a lot about like the profit incentive that's behind this, and that's obviously a huge part of the equation that can't be overstated, but there's also some, like, part of also what's fueling this is legitimate economic anxiety in parts of the state that have seen sort of the departure of industry, that like places like DeSoto County are particularly vulnerable to big promises of, you know, a boon to your tax base, a bunch of jobs for people where there just are less and less good paying jobs these days. You know, these proposals are often popping up in counties that have higher poverty rates than the rest of the state. And so I think that that's an important thing to talk about because, you know, yes, there is big money involved, but also there are some more well-intentioned reasons why local officials were taking a look at this in the first place. And I think that brings up a whole new set of questions that we don't have time to get into right now.
Yeah, you stood up. Go ahead.
I think you hit the nail on the head. There's an executive order, federal presidential actions, accelerating federal permitting of data center infrastructure that was signed on July 23rd. This is being pushed from the top down. And that whole, yeah, well, we'll let the states decide. And the states say, oh, we'll let the localities. It's all about, you know, consolidation of, you know, it's like a reverse kind of thing. Like when they broke Roe v. Wade, yeah, let's leave it to the states. Yeah, that's what's happening here. How'd that work out for all you women in the audience and your daughters and your granddaughters?
Go ahead.
Christian, I got a quick question for you, Chris.
Oh.
Right after her.
Has anyone considered there's a possibility that with the proposal to reduce or change the homestead clause with the homestead law, that possibly, we all know that if that happens, that rural areas will be impacted significantly in a negative way? And is there a possibility that it's intentional? Because we want to starve the rural areas to make them desperate so that they will not be able to refuse the data center because they'll have no other way to bring in any money.
I mean, can't speculate about anybody's intentions, obviously, but to your point, I had a conversation with a county commissioner in DeSoto who said, he cited the possible tax revenue that this would bring, and he said, and we're gonna need that even more if this tax measure passes. And so I think it's something that's certainly on the minds of counties, and in particular poor and rural counties in Florida.
I would say it seems pretty well architected.
We promised her next.
Red shirt.
Yeah.
Christian, would you talk, I very much appreciate you paralleling 180 and obviously the data centers. Could you talk to the success or potential success of Sarasota County challenging half-acre and developing the celery fields? If Sarasota County is successful, that will return home rule to the counties, or will help return some home rule.
Sure, I can mention it quickly, this is kind of on topic, but you know, a developer is suing Sarasota County to build housing that's a celery field bird sanctuary. It is an example that, and now they're trying to use something called the Live Local Act to build, I believe, 800 plus apartment units there. That is an example of a state preemption of localities trying to assert their power to block developments or say these developments aren't right, and the state passing laws to preempt that and say, no, as long as you appeal to the state, you appeal to state law, it's okay. That infrastructure exists for housing developments that could very easily be used on AI data centers.
Just to add one thought to that, because like everything is connected sort of thing. The Attorney General of Florida is right now out there intervening in local lawsuits on behalf of developers, essentially looking to convince courts to take as strong a reading from a preemption point of view as possible, right? So that's something to keep in mind. The Attorney General plays a large role, particularly if we go down the path of there's litigation between testing 484 against 180 and stuff. So the Attorney General's race is one you should be thinking about in the context of data centers amongst every other issue that's sort of important to you.
Jason, along those same lines, you talked about citizen engagement being important in many different ways. Could you also briefly talk about what the legislature has done to make it more difficult for citizens to do things like statewide ballot initiatives and taking power away from citizens and investing it in essentially the legislature?
Yeah, so that softball of a question was, the question is, what else has the legislature done? So the importance, like we've repeatedly emphasized the importance of citizen engagement and people sort of involving themselves in these elections and legislative processes and making sure their representatives know they're paying attention. And at the same time that is happening, there has been an intentional effort at Tallahassee, and this goes back 2 decades at least, probably even before my time paying attention, but to sort of like cut off the pathways to citizen engagement and cut off and consolidate power in Tallahassee. We have talked an awful lot about preemption as a major issue in this, and Senate Bill 180 is sort of like the biggest example of that in preemption. For those that don't know what that term means, that's when the state government essentially passes a law that takes powers away from a city or a county to be able to address it. That's called a preemption, right? But to Michael's point, there are other avenues for change. Like for instance, I mean, if the governor and legislature weren't responsive to you on, say, something about data centers, in the past it would have been possible to do a citizens initiative, a petition drive for a constitutional amendment, essentially go above the governor's head on this sort of thing. But the legislature has made a very intentional effort over the last few years. This was actually very important to Ron DeSantis, that has made citizens initiatives not impossible, but so difficult that we have yet to see a successful, correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but I don't think we have seen anything make the ballot since they changed the law the last time. They've made, and there are a number of things. They raise thresholds. They also create, they narrow the time frames you have to collect signatures and when you have to turn them in. They also, one of the big things they do is they create all sorts of new like procedural hurdles that you have to make, and if you trip over any of them, they create an astronomical fine. So the issue becomes like if you're a group collecting petitions, it becomes there's actually like a lot of like financial liability you're taking on. So it just discourages folks from even pursuing it in the same place. And the larger point is, yeah, there has been an effort to try and cut out citizen engagement. I would argue that gerrymandering is a big part of this. We just saw the legislature, like other states around the country, had like mid-cycle redistricting. For folks that don't know what gerrymandering is, that's when you redraw your legislative boundaries in a way that is designed to favor one party or another. It's why gerrymandering is why we live in a state where 57% of the electorate voted for an abortion rights ballot measure, but we have a legislature that has banned almost all abortion in this state, right? It just leads to elected officials that are completely untethered from sort of the desires of the populace, right? The median voter. And so these are all structural problems. I don't need to sugarcoat just how challenging the influence of money in politics, the absence of avenues around the legislature, and the sort of insulation that gerrymandering provides. But it can still be overcome. So I don't want to make it too discouraging about that. But Michael, you're absolutely right, of course, that they have tried to cut off ways in which you can sort of pressure them and hold them accountable. That's absolutely true.
Well, we managed to get 60% to keep the school board nonpartisan. That was the only one that passed.
Was that a local? Because there was a ballot measure to make them partisan, and it failed. It failed to get 60%.
And we got the 60% to overcome it and keep our school boards nonpartisan. Like this issue should be nonpartisan, except for the people lining their pockets.
Just back to the point about avenues for pursuing, change that maybe feel like they've been foreclosed by Tallahassee or whatever. I was reading an article recently, I think it was in Politico, about data center developers pulling out of Florida or turning to other states because they were basically reading the room, and there's just been this real explosion of anger over the issue. So it's, I think that's pretty almost shocking for me to read.
I just wanted to add to that. I've been to a lot of more government meetings than I wanted to in my life. And I've seen them react very strongly when citizens and residents show up and yell at them and put the fear of God in them. I have not seen them do anything when people just kind of post on social media vaguely. So that would be my only recommendation, is kind of that in-person work.
Do you guys know of any additional permitting, like from the water district or the water authority, that they may have to go through first, even if they have an application in now, that they would have to, that doesn't have anything to do with the city, maybe the state, or is there some layer?
Yeah, they would have to get air and water permits depending on the scale of the project that they're working on. So in DeSoto, I would imagine if the project progressed to the point to the scale that the developers have proposed, they would likely have to apply for an air permit and maybe even federal permitting as well. So
there's layers.
There are definitely layers. I'm gonna pass it off to Emily.
Yeah. So when I alluded earlier to the Fort Meade data center that is, as of right now, looks like it could be the first hyperscale data center in the state in Polk County, that the water issue is the one regulatory hurdle that it's stuck on right now. And that was a change made by Governor DeSantis. His administration sort of quietly made this change that a data center's, correct me if I get this wrong, but I believe a data center's request for water, its proposed water, has to go through the local water management district, and it has to be approved in a public meeting. And all of the water management district board members are appointed by the governor. And so when DeSantis when he started to become more of a vocal data center skeptic, this is something that he did. And his administration actually sent a letter to the Fort Meade data center folks saying, whoa, slow down. You've got to go through a public meeting at the Southwest Florida Water Management District. And that's something they have yet to do, and that's why it hasn't been built yet. Did you have something on that?
I don't think so, other than it's just, it's a good reminder of, it's an opaque process. It's like in many ways designed to be difficult, but like that's another place you have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to who your governor is appointing to water management districts and figure out where they stand on those issues, and you then have to pay attention to water management district meetings and stuff like that. So, I mean, it is worth the effort, but it just shows you all the different pinch points in this process that you need to keep an eye on.
I think you, and then we'll come in.
Looking at just the overall construct of the data centers and the huge footprints and resources that they require, I have been reading that in China, where the government is subsidizing a lot of this, of course, they have figured out a way to shrink them substantially, and that there are organizations that have developed what amounts to a mini nuclear power plant, which is scary in its own way, maybe. Anybody have intel on where that is in terms of feasibility, and whether that might be something that is coming to a town near you? I mean, it's a better alternative, maybe. We just need to know more.
Yeah, I don't have much intel on small scale nuclear. But I do think, that is something you're hearing from the industry. I do think it poses a risk to doing it right now. One of the reasons why moratoriums might make sense, in that one of the dangers to the way we pay for electricity, the way utility rates work is, right, utility companies, where they actually make their money is building stuff, right? That's where the rate of return that Emily talked about gatekeeping. So the utilities want to build as much as possible, this generating infrastructure, that sort of thing. And so, there is a risk that if we were to allow data centers right now, and they required sort of like significant, like, you had to bring on like a multi-billion-dollar power plant or something to serve it, but then like 5 years from now, the technology evolves to the point where like it becomes much cheaper to develop these like, contained nuclear facilities. You could be stuck with these large power infrastructure facilities that still have to be paid for, and that are again, the utilities are guaranteed to recover their investment. And I'm also reminded of, folks might remember Duke Energy's issues with the Crystal River power plant, where it actually screwed up. It made the mistake of damaging that plant, and then it still got the legislature to pass a law allowing it to sort of make its ratepayers collect the costs for its own functional negligence, right? And so these are all sort of things that to the point of the PSC needs to be thinking of just how quickly the technology is changing around that. And as I said, maybe sort of is an argument in favor of sort of moratoriums until we get a better handle on sort of what the sort of infrastructure needs and technology is around this sort of stuff.
I quick question about the rates. I was just in Virginia, and the governor has gotten involved in the merger between Dominion, which is basically the oldest company in the state founded by George Washington, and NextEra, which I guess is the east coast of Florida. What is it doing? And obviously rates are a big issue there because they've approved all these things. What has it done to our rates, and where does that all stand?
NextEra is FPL.
Yeah, so NextEra is the parent company of Florida Power and Light. Yeah, it's Florida Power and Light. NextEra is bigger. It's also got like an unregulated energy subsidiary that doesn't actually do much work in Florida. Does most
So
of
some of the
work.
discussion there is whether they've been saddled with costs in Virginia and they've mismanaged and they need some help.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that becoming an issue in Florida yet. It is the sort of thing to keep in mind. So like, here, let me pass it off to the expert.
I mean, I don't have a ton of information on this, but when I saw the news of the Dominion merger with NextEra, because NextEra is FPL, I asked FPL, if how that could affect the rates that FPL customers pay in Florida, considering the concentration of data centers in Virginia where Dominion is located. If that all becomes one company, and I believe it would become the largest electric utility company in the world, that's a huge deal, and will impact the company that, if you're an FPL customer, you pay your electric bill to. FPL's response to that was, no, it's not going to impact FPL rates at all. So that's what they've said so far, but obviously it's a kind of an open question as we see how the merger progresses.
I don't like conspiracies, but someone said.
Sounds true to me.
Such a bad rap about these data centers in America is that it's being fueled by Russia and China because they want the lead in the data center world and profit of it all.
Well, it's
any truth to the
so no, but that Byron Donalds did the other day say that was probably why there's so much resistance to data centers online, is because of Chinese interference. So it is a talking point being used.
Yeah, NPR did a pretty interesting report a few weeks ago about data center developers and AI companies, and how there's this kind of belief within the industry that most resistance to AI and data centers is coming from, Russian and Chinese propaganda campaigns, and at least their reporting seemed to mostly disprove that. But I would encourage you to read their report. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so before we go, I just wanted to ask my co-panelists if they have any reporting that they're working on that we should be keeping an eye out for, or if they have any last.
Yeah.
That he's working on it.
If you live in Northport or you're concerned about that data center, could you raise your hand?
I don't live in Northport, I'm concerned about water quality.
I love concerns. Could you find me after this? Because I'm working on something. This is a great soliciting opportunity for me. And that's it.
So Christian is working on a story about the Northport Data Center proposal. Something that I'm really interested in is there's this sort of anecdotally, it seems that there is a rising sentiment, a rising concern, not only about data centers, but also about surveillance that seems to be shared by folks kind of across the political spectrum. And so something that I'm really interested in is like, how do these issues interplay with one another, and like how are people thinking about this and responding to these issues across Florida?
Sure, so this is the story that never ends, and so my story list is always growing, but I'll just highlight a couple of fun things that I'm working on because as you can tell from this conversation, there's a lot of really big, scary topics and connections and implications of all of this, and I think it's important to tell stories that give people hope. And one kind of silly little story that is probably going to publish sometime next week is when I was covering the Citrus County data center debate, and that county actually decided to recommend against the data center proposal there, and then the developer withdrew its proposal. In this like 9-hour marathon hearing, one of the things that got brought up was that there was a donkey named Eloise who lives on the fence line of where this data center would be built, and the 11-year-old girl who owns Eloise was really concerned about how she would be impacted. So I'm going to write a story about Eloise next week. Check it out on the Tampa Bay Times.
Follow that up.
Yeah, why do I have to go after that? The animal story should have gone last.
Everybody likes animals.
I'll just mention a couple of stories that we just written this week, so for folks that I think to check out. One involves Senate Bill 180. So we got some records. Folks might know that there was an attempt to repeal Senate Bill 180 this year. It was Senate Bill 840 for anybody that wants to mix up numbers. And the legislation failed to pass this year, even though there was never anybody that testified against it. Nobody ever expressed any sort of public opposition to it. It just sort of died, right? So we got some records that show lobbyists for Pat Neal and Carlos Baruf, a couple of entrepreneurs, were working against that legislation behind the scenes. So we just posted a story about that. Also, one of the things we've been tracking in elections is Facebook, Meta, is playing really aggressively in Florida primaries right now. So there's a really intense Democratic primary in Tampa for a state Senate seat in Tampa and St. Pete right now. And Facebook has started paying for mailers promoting one of the candidates there. So we've also seen Meta is now running ads promoting a top Republican lawmaker in Miami, right? And so much of this ties into they're looking to elect politicians that they consider quote unquote friendly to AI and data centers. And so we're tracking a lot of that. We've written a couple of stories about it. I still like the old newspaper me, I say we, it's me, but we'll be doing a lot more of that sort of work over the course of the election.
Thanks, guys.
I should do animals.